All right, so get ready because today we're going deep, deep into the world of ethics and morality.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a ton of fascinating sources here, and we're going to pull out the most thought-provoking, mind-bending stuff, the stuff that'll make you see the world just a little bit differently. You ready for this?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
Okay, so first things first. Most people probably think ethics and morality are basically the same thing, right?
Yeah, most people do.
I have a feeling it's not quite that simple, though, is it?
You're right. It's not. There is a distinction. It's subtle, but it's important. Think of it this way. Morality is your gut feeling about what's right and wrong. Like it's ingrained, it's often culturally influenced. Things like honesty is good, lying is bad.
Right, the basics.
Yeah, the basics.
Yeah.
Ethics is taking a step back and analyzing why we believe those things. It's a more systematic approach.
So morality is like the foundation, and ethics is how we build on that, especially when things get a little more complicated.
Exactly. And that foundation, that morality, that's crucial. Just imagine a society where stealing was like just accepted.
Oh, yeah.
Total chaos, right? Shared morality, even if it's unspoken, it's what allows us to trust each other, to cooperate, to actually have a functioning society.
Okay, so I'm starting to see why this deep dive is so important. These ideas are working behind the scenes in everything we do.
Absolutely.
We're not just talking about don't steal, though. There's like a whole universe of ethical thought out there.
You're right, there is. Over centuries, all these different schools of thought have emerged, each one offering its own unique framework for grappling with moral questions.
Well, let's dive into those frameworks. I'm ready for some ethical enlightenment. Where should we start?
Let's start with one that's all about character. Virtue ethics.
Ooh, character.
Yeah. This one's championed by Aristotle, and it's not so much about rigid rules.
Okay.
It's more about cultivating good character traits, virtues we call them, like courage, justice, wisdom. The idea is that by developing these virtues, you'll naturally make good choices.
So it's less about following a rule book and more about becoming a certain kind of person.
Yes, precisely. Imagine a doctor who goes above and beyond for their patients consistently.
Yeah.
It's not just about checking boxes on some professional code of conduct. It's because they embody this virtue of caring, and it makes them want to do what's best for their patients. Aristotle believed this path of virtue leads to something called eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia.
It's a Greek word.
That sounds complicated.
It's more than just fleeting happiness, It's
Oh.
like fulfilling your potential as a good person, living a life that feels truly meaningful.
Yeah, like a deep sense of satisfaction, of purpose.
Exactly. Okay, now for a completely different approach, let's jump to deontology.
Deontology, all right?
This one is Kant. Immanuel Kant. Big name. This framework says that there are universal moral principles that we should follow no matter what. It's about duty.
So consequences don't matter as much as sticking to those principles.
Yeah.
That feels kind of counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It can.
Yeah.
But think about it this way. If lying is inherently wrong because it violates trust,
Right.
right?
Right.
A deontologist would say you should never lie, even if a small lie could save someone's life.
Oh, wow.
The principle itself takes priority.
That's a tough one. So in that scenario, a virtue ethicist might consider the specific context, the virtues involved, but a deontologist is drawing a hard line.
Exactly. It's
Like-
about identifying those universal moral laws that apply to everyone, regardless of the situation.
Okay, so we've got virtue ethics focused on character, deontology on duty. There's another big one out there, right? Utilitarianism.
That's right, utilitarianism.
Oh,
This one shifts the focus to the consequences of actions.
okay.
Developed by thinkers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill,
Mm-hmm.
the goal is to maximize happiness, minimize suffering for the greatest number of people.
So it's a numbers game. The greater good is what matters most.
You could say that, yeah. Imagine a situation where you have to allocate limited resources, like during a pandemic.
Yeah, tough decisions.
Tough decisions. A utilitarian approach might prioritize those most likely to survive, even if it means others with less of a chance miss out. It's about the overall outcome.
That makes sense, but I can already see how this could lead to some really tricky ethical debates, like who decides what the greatest good even is?
Exactly. It brings up all sorts of questions about how we measure happiness, suffering, and who gets to decide what's best for the majority.
All right, so we've got these three very different ways of looking at ethical decisions, but I'm guessing there are even more frameworks out there.
Ooh, there are more. Let's talk about ethical relativism. This one shakes things up a bit.
Okay.
It suggests that morality isn't actually universal.
Whoa.
Yeah, it says that what's right or wrong depends on your culture, your context.
So no absolute truths, just different perspectives. It's like how polygamy is accepted in some cultures, but considered wrong in others.
Exactly.
Are we just supposed to say, well, everyone has their own truth? That feels a little too easy.
It's not about saying anything goes. Ethical relativism really emphasizes understanding those different moral systems, not necessarily condoning them, but understanding them. It reminds us there isn't always a simple right answer that applies everywhere.
Okay, I can see how recognizing that could help avoid some major misunderstandings, especially in a world that's so interconnected. You mentioned one more framework, right? Something about existentialism.
Ah, yes,
Yeah.
existentialism. This one's a bit of a wild card.
Okay.
Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, they argued that there's no inherent meaning in the universe. It's
Whoa.
up to each individual to create their own meaning and values.
So radical freedom, but also radical responsibility.
Yeah, exactly. If you're choosing your own path, there's no one else to blame if things go wrong. A good example might be someone who chooses a career based purely on passion.
Right.
Even if it means going against societal expectations or financial stability or what have you, they're defining their own moral compass.
Okay, so we've got these 5 major frameworks for ethical thought. But before we go any further, I'm kind of curious about something a little more fundamental. Where did this whole concept of morality even come from?
Ah, the big question.
Yeah. Is it something we're born with, or is it all learned?
That is a question that has fascinated philosophers and scientists for ages.
I bet.
And there's no single answer, but evidence suggests it's a bit of both nature and nurture.
Okay, so what's the nature part of the equation?
Well, there's evidence that morality has biological roots, things that helped our ancestors survive and thrive as social creatures.
Are we talking basic instincts here, like empathy and fairness?
Exactly. Think about mirror neurons. These are cells in our brains that fire both when we do something and when we see someone else do it. They're thought to be the basis for empathy, allowing us to, understand others' emotions.
So it's like our brains are wired for connection, for feeling what others feel.
Yeah,
That's pretty profound.
it is. And fairness, too. There was this fascinating experiment where monkeys refused to participate in a task when they saw others being rewarded unfairly.
Really?
Yeah. This suggests that a basic sense of justice might be deeply ingrained even in our primate cousins.
Wow, even monkeys have a sense of fair play.
It seems that way.
But we're obviously more complex than monkeys, so how does the nurture part come in?
Well, as humans develop more complex societies, culture took over, shaping and refining our moral codes over, millennia.
Okay, so we're talking about religious traditions, philosophical systems, all of that.
Exactly, the Ten Commandments, for example.
Right.
A very clear set of rules aimed at promoting social harmony. In the East, you've got Confucianism, which emphasizes proper relationships, respect within a hierarchy. Each culture develops moral systems that reflect its unique values and needs.
It's so fascinating. It's like we've got this biological foundation for morality, and then culture comes along and builds upon it. It creates this incredible diversity of ethical systems.
It does.
And as we move into the modern world, things get even more complex, right? Globalization, technology, it all brings a whole new set of challenges we couldn't have imagined even a century ago.
Oh, absolutely.
You're talking about things like AI, genetic engineering, the climate crisis.
All of that, yes.
Yeah.
Issues that are pushing the boundaries of our ethical thinking, forcing us to confront questions we just never had to before.
Well, this is definitely a deep dive I'm glad we're taking together.
Me too.
It feels like we're only just getting started, though. Where do we go from here?
Well, now that we've got a grasp on the historical and theoretical background, I think it's time to move on to how these ideas play out in our daily lives.
Yeah.
After all, ethics isn't just a thought experiment. It's about making choices, big and small, that shape our world.
I'm ready to see how this all applies to the real world. Let's dive in. So we've spent part 1 really laying the groundwork. We talked about all these different ways people have thought about ethics throughout history. Now, I want to see how those ideas play out in our lives, like right now in the 21st century, with all the wild new dilemmas we're facing.
Yeah, it's not enough to just have these frameworks in the abstract. The real challenge is applying them to the actual world.
Exactly. So where do we even start? What are like the biggest ethical battlegrounds we're dealing with these days?
Well, one that's impossible to ignore is privacy in the digital age. I mean, think about it. Social media, data collection, constant surveillance, it's all raising these questions about where the line is, between convenience and our right to privacy.
It's true. It does feel like every move we make online is being like tracked and analyzed. Is there even such a thing as privacy anymore?
That's the question, isn't it? And that's where those ethical frameworks we were talking about can be really helpful. Like a utilitarian might look at this and say, well, the benefits of data collection, like personalized services or targeted advertising, those outweigh the potential privacy risks.
So as long as it's being used to like make our lives easier or more efficient, it's okay.
Yeah.
But what about the people who are, really uncomfortable with that level of data collection? Do their feelings just not matter?
That's the tension, right? And a deontologist would probably push back on that and say certain rights, like the right to privacy, they're just non-negotiable, period. No amount of convenience or societal benefit justifies violating those rights.
Okay, so two very different approaches already. What about someone looking at this through like a virtue ethics lens? How would they see it?
A virtue ethicist might focus on cultivating virtues like honesty and transparency, especially online interactions. It's about recognizing that even though we're interacting through screens, there are still real people on the other side. Building trust, respecting their privacy, those are key.
So, less about hard and fast rules and more about building an online world where people feel safe and respected.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that ethical relativism comes into play here too.
Mhm.
Different cultures have very different ideas about privacy.
Yeah.
What might feel like a huge violation in one culture might be totally acceptable in another.
Right, we can't forget that,
Mm.
especially in a world that's, becoming more and more globalized. Okay, so privacy in the digital age, definitely a hot topic. What other ethical minefields are we navigating these days?
Well, artificial intelligence is another big one that's bringing up all these new ethical questions. As these systems become more sophisticated, we really have to think carefully about how they're being used and what that means for, well, humanity.
It's true. It feels like we're entering this uncharted territory where machines are making more and more decisions for us. It's exciting, but it's also kind of terrifying.
Yeah, it is. And that's why we need these ethical frameworks now more than ever. Think about it. Algorithms are being used in everything: hiring, loan applications, even criminal justice. But what if those algorithms are biased?
That is a scary thought. You're saying that if the data that these algorithms are trained on is flawed, it could actually, like, make existing inequalities even worse.
Precisely. And it's not always intentional either. Bias can creep into these systems in really subtle ways. But the consequences are real. Now, a utilitarian might say that, okay, we need to carefully weigh those risks against the potential benefits of AI, things like increased efficiency or better decision-making.
So again, it's like this balancing act. But a deontologist would probably say, hold on, there are certain principles we can't compromise on, even in the name of progress.
Exactly. They'd emphasize the need for transparency, accountability in these systems. If a machine is making decisions that impact people's lives, we need to understand how those decisions are being made and who's responsible when something goes wrong.
Makes sense. What about a virtue ethicist? How do they approach this?
A virtue ethicist would probably focus on the virtues we need to cultivate in ourselves as we develop and interact with these, well, increasingly powerful systems. Things like wisdom, humility, foresight, those are going to be crucial. If we want to navigate this landscape responsibly, that is.
So it's not just about programming machines to be ethical, it's about being ethical ourselves in how we use them.
Yes, exactly. And it's worth noting that existentialist ethics come into play here too. Because as we hand over more and more of our decision-making power to machines, we're essentially shaping our own destiny. We need to be mindful of the choices we're making. What kind of world are we creating?
Mind-blowing stuff. Okay, so we've talked about privacy and AI. I'm guessing there are even more ethical challenges on our plate right now.
Oh, absolutely. We haven't even touched on the climate crisis, which some might argue is the defining ethical challenge of our time.
It's true, the stakes are so high, and the potential consequences of inaction are terrifying. How do we even begin to grapple with something so massive and complex, ethically speaking, I mean?
Well, again, these frameworks can help us sort through the different viewpoints. A utilitarian might say that the most important thing is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, like as quickly as possible to minimize suffering for everyone now and in the future.
So taking swift action to prevent those worst-case scenarios.
Exactly. But a deontologist might argue that we have a moral duty to protect the environment, no matter the cost.
So even if it means sacrifices, even if it's not the most efficient way.
That's the deontological view, yeah. A virtue ethicist might focus on cultivating virtues like sustainability, compassion, recognizing that interconnectedness of all living things. making choices that reflect that.
Living in a way that minimizes our impact ensures a healthy future for everyone.
Right. And it's important to remember that ethical relativism is at play here too. Different cultures view their relationship with the natural world very differently. Different values when it comes to environmental protection. Finding common ground, working together despite those differences, that's going to be key.
It's all so complex, and the stakes just feel higher and higher. Are we even up to the challenge?
That's where personal responsibility comes in. We can't just wait for governments or corporations to solve these problems for us. We each have a role to play in creating a more ethical and just world.
Okay, so how do we translate all of this into action? How do we actually live more ethically in our daily lives?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's exactly what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, ancient philosophers, modern-day dilemmas, all kinds of stuff. But now I want to get practical. How do we take all this knowledge about ethics, and actually apply it to our lives?
You're right. It's not enough to just think about ethics. It's about actually making choices, big and small, that reflect what we believe in.
So where do we even begin? Like, it feels like we're surrounded by these huge, complex issues. What can one person do?
Well, remember back in the first part of our deep dive when we were talking about the importance of reflecting on our values?
Right.
That's where it all starts. Figuring out what we believe in, what our moral compass is actually pointing towards.
Right, so it's not about adopting someone else's whole ethical framework. It's about figuring out what resonates with us and building from there.
Exactly. Once you have a better understanding of your own values, you can start looking for ways to align your actions with those values.
Okay, so what might that look like in practice?
Well, think about your daily routines. What are the choices you make every day? What you buy, what you eat, how you get around, how you interact with others. These are all opportunities to make ethical decisions.
Okay, so like choosing to buy fair trade coffee or biking to work instead of driving or being mindful of, my energy consumption, those kinds of things.
Exactly. Those are all great examples. It's about integrating those values into your daily life. And it's not just about individual choices either. It's also about how we participate in our communities, the wider world.
So being an informed voter, supporting organizations that are doing work we believe in, speaking out against injustice when we see it.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're not just isolated individuals, we're part of a larger social fabric. Our choices have an impact, and we have a responsibility to use our voices, our actions, to create positive change.
That makes a lot of sense, but I think for a lot of people, it's that speaking out part that feels really challenging. Like, what advice would you give to someone who wants to be more vocal about their values, but is afraid of, conflict or judgment?
Yeah, I get that. It's important to approach those conversations with empathy,
Yeah.
with respect.
Hmm.
Remember, the goal isn't necessarily to change someone's mind or win an argument.
Right.
It's more about sharing your perspective, listening to others, hopefully finding some common ground.
So having those tough conversations, but in a way that feels like constructive, not confrontational.
Exactly. And sometimes the most powerful way to speak out is simply by living your values authentically. People notice that, and it can inspire them to reflect on their own choices.
It's like that saying, be the change you wish to see in the world.
Exactly. And remember, finding your tribe, those people who share your values, that can make a big difference too. Surrounding yourself with like-minded people, it can give you support, encouragement, and it can make it a lot easier to take action together.
So join a group, volunteer, connect with people who are working towards the same goals. All of that can help amplify your impact.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of those connections. They can make this whole journey of, living ethically less daunting.
Yeah, more joyful.
More joyful, exactly.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. I mean, we've explored the complexity of ethics, wrestled with some really tough questions. I think we've all come away with a deeper understanding of how these ideas really shape our lives.
I agree, and I hope it's inspired our listeners to really be more mindful of their choices,
Yeah.
to see themselves as active participants in creating a world that is more ethical.
Because ultimately, ethics isn't just this philosophical concept. It's a way of life. It's about who we are, how we treat each other, the kind of legacy we leave behind.
Beautifully said.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave our listeners with one final thought. What's one small ethical choice you can make today? Keep pondering that question, deep divers. And until next time, may your actions reflect your values and help create a world we can all be proud of.